Adrian Holloway raised his champagne glass on the deck of his yacht, laughed at something his mistress whispered in his ear, and silenced his phone for the fourth time that night. While 40 miles away, his wife screamed his name alone in a hospital room, giving birth to his son without him. He would later call it a misunderstanding. The photo that surfaced online called it something else. If you're with me tonight, drop the name of the city you're watching from in the comments. Let's see how far this story travels. Like the video, stay until the end. This one earns it. The lights of the marina blurred gold and white against the black water as the Athena's Pride eased away from the dock just after 9 in the evening. Adrian Holloway stood at the bow with a glass of Dom Perignon in his hand, his tailored linen shirt open at the collar, looking every bit the man who had built a $4 billion empire out of nothing but code and ruthlessness. He was 44 years old, still lean, still sharp-jawed, the kind of handsome that made people forget to ask hard questions. Beside him stood Vanessa Hale, 28, in a backless emerald dress that caught the deck lights every time she moved. She had her hand resting on his forearm, casual and proprietary at the same time, the way a woman touches something she already considers hers. "You look like you're somewhere else," she said, tilting her head up at him. "I'm right here." He smiled, but it didn't quite reach his eyes. "Your phone's been buzzing in your pocket for the last 20 minutes. "It's always buzzing." He drank. "That's what happens when you run a company people are afraid will collapse without you." She laughed, a bright practice sound, and pressed closer. "Tonight isn't about the company. Tonight is about us." Adrian let himself believe that for a moment, because believing it was easier than the alternative. The alternative was a woman named Evelyn Mercer, 36 weeks pregnant, who that morning had told him, in a voice gone thin with exhaustion, that the doctor wanted her to start tracking contractions. He'd kissed her forehead, told her he had a dinner with investors in Singapore that couldn't wait, and left before she could argue. There had been no dinner in Singapore. There had only been this: champagne, a borrowed yacht, and a woman who made him feel 25 years old instead of the tired, hollowed-out man he'd become somewhere along the way to becoming rich. 2 decks below, his phone lit up again. Evelyn Mercer, wife. He had silenced it after the 3rd call. Evelyn felt the first real contraction at 9:42 p.m., a tightening so sharp it knocked the breath out of her lungs and left her gripping the kitchen counter with both hands. She'd had false labor twice in the last 2 weeks, sharp cramps that faded after 20 minutes, and for a moment she told herself this was the same. Just her body rehearsing, just nerves. Then the second contraction hit 9 minutes later, and she knew. "Adrian," she said into the phone, voice tight, "I need you to call me back. I think it's happening." No answer. She tried again 4 minutes later, voicemail. She sat on the edge of the bed in their Tribeca penthouse, alone in 11,000 square feet of marble and glass that her husband's money had bought, and stared at the phone like it might do something if she just willed it hard enough. Her sister Claire lived 40 minutes away in Westchester. Her mother, Diane Reyes, formerly Diane Mercer before she'd remarried, was 2 hours north in Connecticut. Neither of them would make it in time if this moved as fast as it felt like it was moving. She called Adrian a 3rd time. A 4th. By the 5th call, the contractions were 6 minutes apart, and Evelyn Mercer understood, with a clarity that felt almost peaceful in its cruelty, that her husband was choosing not to answer. She called her own car service instead. The yacht's interior lounge smelled like cedar and expensive perfume. Adrian had moved the party below decks around 11, when the wind picked up and Vanessa complained about her hair. 6 other people were there now. A hedge fund manager named Roy Castellano, his date, 2 of Vanessa's friends from the gallery world, and Adrian's longtime business partner, Marcus Whitfield, who kept glancing at Adrian with an expression that wasn't quite disapproval but wasn't comfortable either. "You good?" Marcus asked, sitting down beside him while Vanessa laughed at something across the room. "I'm great." Adrian's smile was loose now, 3 glasses in. "Why wouldn't I be?" "Your phone's lighting up the whole table, man." Marcus nodded at the device sitting face down near the ice bucket. "That's the 4th time in 20 minutes. Adrian glanced at it like it was an insect he was deciding whether to swat. It's Evelyn. She's been anxious lately. Pregnancy stuff. How far along is she now? 36 weeks. He said it the way a man might mention a meeting on his calendar, says, present tense, low priority. Marcus's jaw worked for a second. 36 weeks isn't nothing, Adrian. My sister went into labor at 36 weeks, fast too. Evelyn's fine. She's got people, her mother, her sister. Does she know you're not answering? Adrian picked up the glass instead of the phone. I'll call her back when we dock. Marcus didn't say anything else, but he didn't look away either, and something in that silence should have unsettled Adrian more than it did. Instead, he turned back toward Vanessa, who was waving him over to take a photo with the skyline behind them. The city lights smeared gold across the water like something out of a film neither of them deserved to be in. The hospital was called St. Aldrich Medical Center, a private maternity wing on the Upper East Side that Adrian's money had practically built a new floor for 2 years earlier. Back when their first attempt at a pregnancy had ended in a miscarriage, neither of them spoke about anymore. Evelyn arrived at 10:58 p.m., already gripping the car door handle through a contraction. The driver, a kind older man named Felix who'd worked for the family for 6 years, half carrying her into the lobby. Mrs. Holloway Mercer, the night nurse said, recognizing her instantly. Let's get you upstairs. Where's my husband? Evelyn managed between breaths. It wasn't really a question. It came out flat, like something she already knew the answer to and hated saying out loud. Is he on his way? I don't know. She gripped the nurse's arm as another contraction rolled through her, sharper now, the kind that left spots behind her eyes. I don't know where he is. They got her into a wheelchair. Somewhere behind her, Felix was on his own phone, calling Claire, calling Diane, his voice low and urgent in a way that told Evelyn this was already happening faster than anyone had prepared for. By the time they got her into the delivery room and a doctor named Priya Anand was checking her dilation, Evelyn had called Adrian 11 times. She tried once more from the hospital bed, the phone trembling slightly in her hand, sweat already gathering at her hairline. It rang 4 times. Then his voicemail picked up. That same recorded voice, warm and confident. You've reached Adrian Holloway. I'm probably saving the world or making money, leave a message. A joke he'd recorded years ago when they were still happy enough to find it funny. Evelyn didn't leave a message. She set the phone down on the tray beside the bed, face up, and didn't pick it up again. Mrs. Mercer, Dr. Anand said gently, you're at 7 centimeters. This baby's coming fast. I need you to focus on me now, okay? Just me. Evelyn nodded, tears sliding sideways into her hair, and for the first time in 11 years of marriage, she let herself fully understand what kind of man she had built a life with. Back on the yacht, somewhere around midnight, Vanessa pulled Adrian onto the upper deck where the music was quieter and the stars actually showed through the city haze. She had her phone out, angling it for a selfie, his arm wrapped loosely around her waist, both of them laughing at nothing in particular. The easy, unguarded laugh of 2 people who believed, for that exact moment, that consequences were something that happened to other people. Post it, he said, the champagne making him generous, careless, the kind of man who didn't think about cause and effect anymore because money had spent a decade teaching him he didn't have to. You sure? Your bored people follow you. Let them see I have a life. He kissed her temple. I work hard. I'm allowed one night. She posted it at 12:14 a.m. A glowing golden photo of Adrian Holloway with his arm around a woman who was not his wife. The caption reading, Best Night on the Water. Geotagged to the marina, time-stamped automatically. Public. It would take less than 6 hours to reach Evelyn's family. It would take less than 12 to reach a financial journalist named Renata Okafor, who covered Holloway dynamics for a major business outlet, and had been quietly building a file on Adrian's spending habits for 2 months. It would take less than a week to start unraveling a man who had spent his entire adult life believing unraveling was something that happened to other people. But at 12:14 a.m., Adrian Holloway didn't know any of that yet. He only knew the champagne was cold, the woman beside him was beautiful, and somewhere in the back of his mind, in a place he'd gotten very good at not visiting, his phone sat dark and silent with 11 missed calls from a wife he had decided, without ever quite admitting it to himself, mattered less than this. Says, at 1:07 a.m., in a delivery room 12 miles away, Evelyn Mercer gave one final, exhausted push, and a thin, furious wail filled the air, the sound of a boy entering a world his father hadn't bothered to show up for. He's here, Dr. Anand said, voice softening with the particular tenderness doctors reserve for this exact moment. He's here, and he's perfect. They laid him on Evelyn's chest, slick and red-faced and screaming, 7 pounds, 2 ounces of pure, undeniable life. Evelyn looked down at her son, at the dark tuft of hair, the tiny fists already curling and uncurling against her skin, and something in her chest cracked open and rebuilt itself in the same instant. Hi, she whispered, voice raw. Hi, baby. I'm here. I'm right here. She didn't say we're here. There was no we in that room. There was Evelyn and Claire, who had made it just in time and stood crying quietly by the window, and a nurse adjusting monitors, and a newborn boy who would later be named Ethan Mercer, his mother's name, not his father's, a decision Evelyn made in that exact moment without consulting anyone, least of all the man who wasn't there to object. Her phone buzzed once on the tray table. A text, not a call. Sorry, missed your calls. Big night with investors. Everything okay? Call me in the morning. Evelyn read it twice. Then she turned the phone face down on the tray, pressed her lips to her son's damp forehead, and made a promise to him that she intended to keep for the rest of her life. That whatever else happened, whatever his father turned out to be, Ethan would never spend a single day of his childhood wondering if he mattered. Outside the hospital window, the city kept glittering the way it always did, indifferent and beautiful. The same skyline Adrian Holloway had been admiring from the deck of a yacht while his son took his first breath without him. He had no idea, not yet, that a photograph posted at 12:14 a.m. was already moving through the world faster than any apology he would ever try to give, and that by the time he walked into that hospital room the next morning, smiling, confident, already rehearsing his excuse, the woman waiting for him would already know everything. Adrian woke at 9:40 in the morning with a headache pressing behind his eyes and a mouth that tasted like stale champagne, and it took him a full 30 seconds in the unfamiliar guest cabin to remember where he was and why his phone, finally back in his hand, showed 18 missed calls and a string of texts that didn't make sense in the order he was reading them. Claire Mercer. Where the hell are you? Marcus Whitfield. Call me. Now. Don't wait. Unknown number. This is Diane. My daughter gave birth alone last night. You should be ashamed. He sat up too fast and the headache turned into something sharper, something closer to dread. He scrolled back through the timestamps and watched the night reconstruct itself in reverse. Vanessa's laugh. The cold champagne. The photo she'd posted that he'd told her to post. Let them see I have a life. And somewhere underneath all of it, a memory trying to surface that he didn't want to look at directly yet. He called Evelyn. It rang twice and went to voicemail. He called again. Same thing. He found Vanessa in the galley kitchen of the yacht, still in last night's dress, drinking coffee out of a chipped mug like nothing in the world had changed since midnight. Morning, she said, and then she saw his face and the word died in her mouth. Evelyn had the baby, Adrian said. His voice came out strange, flattened, like he was reading someone else's bad news off a teleprompter. Last night, while we were... He stopped. He didn't finish the sentence because finishing it meant admitting where the sentence ended. Vanessa set the mug down carefully. Is she okay? Is the baby okay? I don't know. Nobody's telling me anything. Everyone's just... He held up the phone, the long list of missed calls, and the one text he hadn't let himself reread yet, the one from Claire that simply said, He's here. He's healthy. You weren't. He didn't say anything else. He grabbed his jacket off the back of a chair and went up to the deck, where the marina was already busy with the ordinary business of a Tuesday morning, gulls wheeling over the water, a dock worker coiling rope, the whole world moving forward as if nothing in it had cracked open 12 hours earlier. He called his driver. 40 minutes to the hospital in morning traffic. He spent every one of those 40 minutes rehearsing. By the time the car pulled up outside St. Aldrich Medical Center, Adrian had built himself a version of the night that he could survive saying out loud. An emergency call from Singapore that ran long, a dead phone battery, terrible timing, terrible luck, Nothing more sinister than bad timing piled on top of bad timing. He believed it by the time he stepped into the elevator. That was the thing about Adrian Holloway, that even people who loved him struggled to forgive. He had a gift for believing his own excuses in real time, the same way he'd believed 3 months earlier that an affair with a 28-year-old gallery consultant was somehow a private matter that didn't touch the rest of his life. He knocked once on the door of Evelyn's hospital room and walked in without waiting for an answer, the way he walked into most rooms. The scene stopped him cold. Evelyn was sitting up in bed, pale but composed, her dark hair pulled back, a hospital blanket over her knees. In her arms, wrapped in a soft blue blanket, was a small, sleeping bundle that Adrian's eyes went to immediately and then couldn't leave. But it wasn't just Evelyn in the room. Claire stood by the window, arms crossed, her expression carved from stone. Diane Reyes sat in the chair closest to the bed, her coat still on, like she'd come straight from the car and hadn't planned on staying long enough to take it off. And standing near the door, arms behind his back, was a man Adrian recognized immediately and felt his stomach drop at the sight of Walter Mercer, Evelyn's uncle, a retired federal judge whose presence in any room tended to change the temperature of it. Evelyn. Adrian's voice cracked slightly on her name. He stepped toward the bed. God, I'm so sorry that the calls didn't go through. I was in a meeting that ran into the night, and my phone died, and by the time Stop! Evelyn didn't raise her voice. That was somehow worse than if she had. Just stop talking, Adrian. He stopped. Do you want to know his name? She asked. Something in her tone made the question feel like a trap, but he nodded anyway, because not nodding felt impossible. Yes, of course I do. Ethan. She looked down at the baby in her arms, and for a moment her face softened in a way that had nothing to do with Adrian at all. Ethan Mercer. Adrian blinked. Mercer? Not Holloway? No. She looked back up at him, and there was nothing soft in her face anymore. Not Holloway. Evelyn, we should talk about that. That's a decision we make together. We don't make decisions together anymore, Adrian. She said it simply, like she was stating the time, and the simplicity of it landed harder than anger would have. We stopped making decisions together the day you started making them with Vanessa Hale instead. The name hit the room like a dropped glass. Claire's arms tightened across her chest. Diane's jaw set. Walter Mercer, by the door, didn't move at all, didn't react, just watched Adrian with the flat, patient attention of a man who had spent 30 years on the bench learning how to watch people lie. I don't know what you're talking about, Adrian said, and even as the words left his mouth, he heard how hollow they sounded. Don't. Evelyn's voice cracked for the first time, not with sadness, but with something closer to disgust. Don't you dare stand in this room 12 hours after your son was born and lie to my face. Evelyn, I've known for 4 months. She said it flatly, almost clinically, like she'd practiced saying it exactly that way so it wouldn't break apart in her mouth. Since February, I found a receipt from a hotel on Spring Street, a suite you booked under your assistant's name, and I told myself it was business. I really tried to tell myself that. And then I found another one in March, and another in April, so I stopped telling myself stories, Adrian, and I hired someone. Adrian's face went white. You hired someone to follow me? I hired an investigator to confirm what I already knew, because I was 7 months pregnant and I needed proof before I let myself believe my husband was destroying our family. She reached over to the nightstand with her free hand, careful not to disturb the sleeping baby, and pulled out a thin manila folder, sliding it across the blanket toward the foot of the bed. Dinners at Lucia's on 47th, the loft on Green Street you put in an LLC neither of us has ever discussed. A diamond bracelet from Cartier in March that never showed up on our joint statement because you paid for it out of a private account I wasn't supposed to know existed. And last night, her voice finally shook, just slightly, just enough. Last night there's a photo, Adrian. Time-stamped. Geotagged. Your arm around her, both of you laughing. Posted at 12:14 in the morning. I was pushing at 12:51. Ethan was born at 1:07. The room was silent except for the soft mechanical beep of a monitor somewhere behind the bed. "I can explain the photo," Adrian said, and even he could hear how pathetic it sounded the moment it left his mouth. "Explain it then." Claire's voice cut in from the window, sharp and furious. "Go ahead. Explain to my sister why you were on a yacht with your mistress while she was alone in an ambulance." "I didn't know it was happening that fast, Claire. Nobody told me the labor would—" "She called you 11 times." Claire's voice rose. 11, Adrian. I have the call log. Evelyn forwarded it to me at 6 this morning because she couldn't stop staring at it. 11 calls and you couldn't be bothered to step away from your champagne for 30 seconds. I was working. You were not working. Walter Mercer spoke for the first time, and his voice, low and measured, somehow cut through the room more effectively than Claire's shouting had. I called Marcus Whitfield myself this morning, Adrian. He confirmed there was no investor dinner in Singapore last night. There was a party, on a yacht, with 6 guests, none of whom were business contacts. Adrian turned, stricken. You called Marcus? I've known Marcus for 15 years. I officiated his wedding. Walter's expression didn't change. He didn't enjoy lying to me on your behalf, and he didn't do it for very long. Adrian felt the room tilting slightly. The careful story he'd built in the back of the car dissolving in real time, each piece of it dismantled faster than he could rebuild it. He looked at Evelyn, at the baby in her arms, at the small fist that had worked its way free of the blanket and was curled against her collarbone, and for one unguarded second something genuine cracked through the panic on his face. Not performance, not strategy, just a man looking at his son for the first time and understanding, with sudden, sickening clarity, that he had already failed him. Can I hold him? Adrian's voice came out smaller than he intended. Evelyn looked at him for a long moment. Then, slowly, she shook her head. Not yet. Evelyn, he's my son. He is. She nodded. And you have 11 missed calls and a photograph that says exactly how much that mattered to you last night. She adjusted the blanket around Ethan, her movements gentle even as her voice stayed hard. You can hold him when I trust you not to drop him the way you dropped everything else. That's not fair. Fair? Evelyn let out a short, humorless laugh that startled even her sister. You want to talk about fair, Adrian? I was alone in a car with Felix while I was in labor. I texted you the address of the hospital, and you didn't even read it until this morning. My mother drove 2 hours in the dark because my husband couldn't be reached. Don't you dare use the word fair with me right now. Diane finally spoke, her voice quieter than her daughter's, but no less firm. Adrian, I have known you for 11 years. I sat across from you at our family table more times than I can count. I genuinely believed you loved my daughter. She paused, and something in her face looked almost sorrowful, like she was grieving a version of him that had never really existed. I don't know who you've become, but I know I don't recognize him. Adrian opened his mouth to respond and found, for possibly the first time in his adult life, that he had nothing prepared. No pitch, no negotiation, no clever reframe. Just the truth sitting in the room like a fifth person, undeniable and exhausted of patience. I made a mistake, he said finally, quietly. I know that's not enough. I know saying it doesn't undo last night. But Evelyn, I love you. I love our son. Whatever happened with Vanessa, it didn't mean... Don't say it didn't mean anything. Evelyn's voice was suddenly very tired. Don't insult me by pretending 4 months of lying to my face meant nothing to you, because if it meant nothing, that's worse, Adrian. That means you risked everything we built for something you didn't even care about. He had no answer to that. He stood there in his rumpled linen shirt, smelling faintly of champagne and salt air, in a room full of people who had watched him fail in real time, and he understood that there was no version of the next sentence that would make any of this smaller. A nurse knocked and stepped in to check Evelyn's vitals, and the interruption broke the standoff just enough for the air in the room to shift. Claire walked over and gently took the baby from Evelyn's arms so the nurse could work, cradling Ethan against her shoulder with the easy confidence of someone who had done this before, murmuring something soft to him that made Adrian's chest ache in a way he didn't have language for. I'd like a few minutes alone with my wife, Adrian said quietly, looking at Walter and Diane. Walter studied him for a long beat. Evelyn, he said, not Adrian, do you want us to stay? Evelyn looked at Adrian, then back at her uncle. "Give us 5 minutes." They filed out, Claire last, throwing one final look over her shoulder that needed no translation. And the door clicked shut, leaving Adrian and Evelyn alone for the first time since before any of this had happened. "Evelyn," he sat carefully on the edge of the bed, not touching her. "Tell me what I can do. Tell me how to fix this." "You can't fix this, Adrian. That's what you still don't understand." She looked at him, and there was no anger left in her voice now, just a flat, bottomless exhaustion. "You think this is a negotiation. You think if you find the right words, the right gesture, the right amount of money or apology, you can patch this the way you patch a bad quarterly report. But this isn't a deal, Adrian. This is my life. This is our son's life. And you spent the most important night of it on a yacht because you couldn't be bothered to put down a champagne glass." "I love you," he said again, because it was the only true thing he had left. "I believe that you think you do." Evelyn's eyes were dry now, strangely calm. "But love isn't a feeling you have while you're doing something else, Adrian. Love is what you choose when it's inconvenient, and you've never once in 11 years chosen me when it was inconvenient." The words landed and stayed because they were true, and Adrian, who had spent his entire career being the smartest person in nearly every room, recognized, with the particular horror of a man finally seeing himself clearly, that he had no rebuttal. "What happens now?" he asked. Evelyn was quiet for a long moment, looking toward the window, where morning light cut a pale line across the floor. "Now I heal. Now I take my son home, and you go figure out what you actually want, because I'm done guessing." "Are you asking for a divorce?" "I'm not asking you anything." She finally turned back to him, and her voice was steady, almost gentle, which somehow made it land harder than if she'd shouted. "I'm telling you that the woman who used to wait by the phone, who used to make excuses for you at dinner parties, who used to believe you when you said, 'Next time, I promise, next time,' that woman doesn't live here anymore. I don't know who's replacing her yet, but it's not going to be someone who forgives this." There was a soft knock, and Claire stepped back in carrying Ethan, who had started to stir, his small face scrunching before settling again against her shoulder. She crossed to the bed and gently transferred him back into Evelyn's arms without a word, then took up her post by the window again, watching Adrian the way a guard watches a door. Adrian looked at his son. Up close, in daylight, Ethan's face had the loose, unformed quality of a newborn, but Adrian could already see fragments of himself in it. The shape of the brow, maybe, or the set of the mouth. And the sight of it broke something open in his chest that he hadn't expected. "Can I just look at him?" he asked. "I won't touch him. I just want to look." Evelyn hesitated, then nodded once, tilting Ethan slightly so Adrian could see his face fully. Adrian leaned forward, careful, and for a long moment he didn't say anything at all. His eyes filled, and he blinked hard, embarrassed by it in a room full of people who had every reason to think his tears were just another performance. "He's beautiful," Adrian whispered. "He is." Evelyn's voice had softened, just barely, the way it always did when it came to her son and nothing else. "And I am going to spend the rest of my life making sure he never once feels what I felt last night. Alone, forgotten, like he didn't matter enough." "I want to be part of that," Adrian said. "Whatever this becomes between us. I want to be his father. Then be one." Evelyn's eyes met his, hard again now. "Not in the way you've been a husband, not with apologies after the fact and promises you don't keep. Show up, Adrian, every time. Not because the cameras are watching, not because it's convenient, but because that's what fathers do." She looked down at Ethan again. "If you can't do that, it's better for both of us if you don't try at all." The door opened again, and a young hospital administrator poked her head in, looking apologetic. "Sorry to interrupt. Mrs. Mercer, there's a gentleman from the press downstairs asking if anyone from the family wants to comment on a photo that's circulating online. Security's handling it, but I wanted you to know." Evelyn closed her eyes briefly. "Already?" "It's been picked up by a couple of business accounts. Something about Holloway Dynamics." The administrator glanced uncertainly at Adrian. "I can have security keep them out of the building." "Thank you," Evelyn said. "Please do." The administrator left, and the room sat in a different kind of silence now. Not just the wreckage of a marriage, but the first cold edge of what was coming next. The world outside this room already starting to take notice, already starting to ask questions that Adrian Holloway, for the first time in his adult life, had no good answer for. Adrian stood slowly, smoothing his shirt with hands that weren't quite steady. "I'll go," he said. "I'll let you rest. But Evelyn—" He stopped at the door, looking back at her, at the baby in her arms, at the family arranged protectively around her like a wall he had no idea how to get through anymore. "I'm going to try. Whatever you think of me right now, I am going to try to be better than I was last night." Evelyn didn't answer him. She looked down at her son instead, brushing one finger gently along his cheek. And Adrian understood, walking out of that hospital room into a hallway that suddenly felt much colder than it had on the way in, that her silence was its own kind of answer. Not a no, not yet, but not the reassurance he'd been hoping for either. He found Marcus waiting near the elevators, phone in hand, his face grim. "You need to see this," Marcus said, turning the screen toward him. It was the photo. 60,000 shares already, and climbing, reposted by an account with 500,000 followers under the caption, "Tech Billionaire Parties with Mistress While Wife Gives Birth Alone." Receipts incoming. Beneath it, a thread had already started. Screenshots, speculation, someone claiming to have worked at the gallery where Vanessa Hale was employed, someone else tagging Holloway Dynamics' official account and asking if the board had a comment. "It's bad," Marcus said quietly, "and it's moving fast." Adrian stared at the screen, at the image of himself laughing with his arm around a woman who wasn't his wife, frozen forever now at 12:14 a.m. And somewhere behind him, through the closed door of Evelyn's hospital room, he could hear, very faintly, the sound of his son beginning to cry. A small, furious sound that Adrian understood. Standing alone in that hallway, he had absolutely no right to walk back in and comfort. He put the phone in his pocket without responding to a single message on it, and for the first time since he'd built his fortune, Adrian Holloway felt the cold, unfamiliar sensation of a problem that money wasn't going to solve. By the third day, the photo had stopped being a photo and become a story, and by the end of the first week, it had stopped being a story and become a verdict. Adrian sat in his corner office on the 41st floor of the Holloway Dynamics Tower, watching the share price tick downward in real time on the screen behind his desk, and understood that the thing he'd spent 18 years building was now bleeding out in front of him in increments of fractions of a point. Renata Okafor's article had run 4 days after the hospital, and it had been worse than anyone on his legal team predicted. The cost of looking away, inside Adrian Holloway's hidden life. It wasn't just the yacht. It wasn't just Vanessa Hale, though the article had her name in the second paragraph and a photo of the Green Street loft by the fourth. It was the receipts, hotel records. The LLC formed 11 months earlier. 2 former employees willing to speak anonymously about a pattern of behavior that suggested this wasn't a single mistake, but a sustained second life, conducted in plain sight of anyone willing to look closely enough. "The board wants a call at 4, said Holloway Dynamics General Counsel, a sharp, exhausted woman named Priya Lindqvist, standing in his doorway with a tablet pressed to her chest like a shield. "I need you to understand something before that call happens, Adrian. This isn't a PR problem anymore." "I know what it is." "I don't think you do." She stepped in and closed the door behind her. 3 institutional investors pulled meetings this week. Vance Capital and Whitmore Group both have language in their agreements about reputational risk to leadership, and legal believes they have grounds to invoke it. We've had 2 separate inquiries from regulators about the Green Street LLC and whether company funds were used to furnish it. And Marcus... She paused. "What about Marcus?" "Marcus retained his own counsel yesterday. He's distancing himself, Adrian, quietly, but he's doing it." Adrian closed his eyes. Marcus Whitfield had been his partner since the company was 4 people in a rented office above a dry cleaner in Bushwick. Marcus had mortgaged his apartment to make payroll in year 2. Marcus had stood up at Adrian's wedding to Evelyn and given a toast that made half the room cry. And now Marcus was hiring lawyers to make sure none of this splashed onto him. "Get him in here," Adrian said. "I want to talk to him myself before the board call." "He won't come, Adrian. I already asked." That was the moment. Sitting in his own office with the city spread out gold and indifferent below him, that Adrian Holloway first understood the shape of what was actually happening to him. Not a scandal that would fade with a well-placed apology and a charitable donation. Not a problem his communications team could outmaneuver with the right narrative. Something structural. Something that had already started eating the foundation while he was still standing on the roof admiring the view. The board call lasted 40 minutes, and Adrian spent the first 20 of them performing contrition he had carefully rehearsed in the mirror that morning. Language about accountability, about personal failures that he was committed to correcting, about how none of this reflected the company's values or its mission. He had given variations of this speech before, after a data breach 2 years earlier, after a product recall the year before that, and it had worked both times because investors mostly cared whether the man steering the ship still had a steady hand on the wheel. This time, nobody was buying it. Adrian. The voice belonged to Howard Ziegler, the board's longest-serving independent director, 71 years old, a man who had backed Adrian's very first round of funding back when Holloway Dynamics was nothing but a slide deck and a confident pitch. His voice, usually warm, was flat now in a way that made Adrian's stomach drop before he'd even finished his sentence. I've known you 18 years. I was at your wedding. I held your hand, figuratively, through 2 near bankruptcies and a federal investigation that could have ended this company before it started. I have never once doubted your judgment as a businessman. Howard, I appreciate that, and I want you to know, let me finish. Howard's voice tightened. This isn't about judgment as a businessman. This is about character. And character, Adrian, is the actual product we're selling to every investor, every partner, every customer who trusts Holloway Dynamics with their data and their money. You didn't just embarrass yourself. You handed our competitors and every regulator who's ever wanted a reason to come after us a gift-wrapped narrative about a CEO who lies to the people closest to him and abandons his responsibilities when it's inconvenient. That's not spin we can manage. That's who you are now, in the public record, permanently. The line was quiet, except for the soft hiss of a dozen muted connections. What are you proposing? Adrian said finally, though he already knew. A leave of absence, effective immediately. Marcus steps in as interim CEO while we assess the path forward. You're forcing me out. We're trying to save the company you built, Adrian, from the man you've apparently become. Howard's voice softened, just slightly, the closest thing to mercy in the entire call. I'm sorry, I genuinely am, but the vote's already been counted informally, 8-1 in favor of the leave. Who voted no? Adrian asked, some pathetic, desperate part of him still hoping. I did, Howard said, for whatever that's worth. Not because I think you're innocent, because I remember who you used to be, and some part of me still wants to believe he's in there somewhere. The call ended shortly after, and Adrian sat alone in his office as the late afternoon light slanted gold and merciless across the floor, and understood, with a clarity that felt almost peaceful in its devastation, that he had lost his company in roughly the same amount of time it had taken to lose his marriage. Both undone not in a single catastrophic moment, but in a slow accumulation of choices he'd made believing he'd never have to answer for them. 2 weeks later, the divorce filing landed, and it landed hard. Evelyn's legal team, led by a formidable attorney named Patricia Osei, who had a reputation in the city for representing spouses of powerful men and winning settlements that made headlines for years afterward, had built a case that went far beyond infidelity. There were financial irregularities buried in the marriage that Evelyn's private investigator had uncovered alongside the affair. Transfers from joint accounts into the Green Street LLC, gifts to Vanessa Hale funded through a shell entity that hadn't been properly disclosed during the prenuptial negotiations 11 years earlier. A pattern of financial concealment that turned what might have been a straightforward, painful divorce into something closer to a forensic excavation. He's going to fight this, Patricia told Evelyn in her office downtown, sliding a folder across the desk. Evelyn sat with Ethan asleep against her shoulder in a carrier, 3 weeks old now, his small chest rising and falling against her with a steadiness that had become the only thing in her life that still felt simple. Men like Adrian don't go quietly. He'll have his own attorneys arguing the prenup protects most of his equity, that the LLC was a legitimate business venture, that the gifts were— "I don't care what he argues," Evelyn said, and her voice was steadier than it had been in weeks. The exhaustion of new motherhood layered now with a kind of grim, focused resolve. "I care about Ethan. I want him protected. Whatever happens to Adrian's company, whatever happens to Adrian, I want my son's future to never depend on his father's choices again." Patricia studied her for a moment, something like respect crossing her face. "There's a mechanism for that. A trust, irrevocable, funded by a significant percentage of marital assets, with you as sole trustee until Ethan comes of age. Given the financial misconduct we've documented, I believe we have strong grounds to argue for a substantial allocation, potentially the majority of Adrian's liquid equity in Holloway Dynamics." "Do it," Evelyn said. "Whatever it takes." The mediation sessions that followed were, by every account from the people who sat through them, brutal in their quiet, procedural way. None of the shouting from the hospital room, just lawyers and financial forensics and Adrian, increasingly gray around the eyes, watching numbers get carved out of his life one line item at a time. "You understand," Patricia said during the third session, sliding a revised proposal across the table, "that the trust structure we're proposing isn't punitive, it's protective. Ethan didn't choose any of this. He deserves a future that isn't contingent on his father's business decisions, his father's reputation, or his father's next mistake." Adrian's attorney, a sharp, unsmiling man named Desmond Cale, started to object, but Adrian held up a hand to stop him. "How much?" Adrian said quietly, looking at Evelyn across the table for the first time that session. She hadn't looked at him much during these meetings, kept her eyes on documents, on Patricia, on anything that wasn't his face, but she looked at him now. 60% of your equity in Holloway Dynamics," Patricia said, "transferred into the trust upon finalization. The remainder of the marital estate divided according to standard formula, adjusted for the financial concealment we've documented." "That's—" Desmond started. "Fine," Adrian said. The room went quiet. Desmond turned to him, incredulous. "Adrian, we can fight this. The prenup gives us grounds to—" "I said it's fine." Adrian's voice cracked slightly, and for a moment the practiced composure he'd been wearing through every session fell away, and what was underneath it looked exhausted and much older than 44. "He's my son. If this is what it takes for him to have a future that doesn't have my name attached to every mistake I've made, then it's fine." Evelyn watched him for a long moment, something complicated moving behind her eyes. Not forgiveness, not yet, maybe not ever, but something that recognized, for the first time since the hospital, a flicker of the man she'd once believed she'd married. "Thank you," she said quietly. It was the first thing she'd said directly to him in 3 sessions. Adrian nodded, unable to manage more than that, and the mediation moved forward. The board finalized Adrian's removal as CEO on a Thursday morning in late autumn, in a vote that took 11 minutes and was, by then, a formality more than a decision. Marcus Whitfield was named permanent CEO the same day. Adrian wasn't on the call. He'd resigned from the board entirely a week earlier, partly because Desmond had advised him it would look better in the ongoing litigation, and partly because Adrian, if he was honest with himself, couldn't stomach sitting through another conversation where men he'd built an empire alongside discussed his failures like a quarterly earnings miss. He moved out of the Tribeca penthouse, Evelyn's now, by mutual agreement, the place where Ethan would grow up, and into a serviced apartment near Union Square that felt, every time he unlocked the door, like a hotel room he'd been assigned rather than a home he'd chosen. Vanessa Hale called him twice in the weeks following the board's decision. He let both calls go to voicemail. The third time she texted instead, "I saw the news. I'm sorry. Can we talk?" He stared at the message for a long time before responding. "I don't think there's anything left to talk about." "That's it? After everything?" Adrian sat on the edge of an unfamiliar bed in an unfamiliar apartment, phone in hand, and thought about the yacht, the champagne, the photo, the 11 missed calls, his son's first cry through a closed hospital door he hadn't been allowed past. "Everything was the problem, Vanessa. I just couldn't see it until I lost everything that mattered." She didn't respond after that. and Adrian didn't expect her to. Whatever they'd had, it had never been built to survive contact with consequences. It had only ever existed in the part of his life where nothing was supposed to cost anything. The lawsuits came next, smaller but persistent, the way scavengers arrive once the larger predators have finished. A former employee alleging he'd been pressured to falsify expense reports related to the Green Street property, a contractor claiming non-payment on renovations to the loft, a minority shareholder filing a derivative suit alleging the board had failed in its oversight duties by allowing Adrian's personal misconduct to create material risk to the company. None of them, individually, would have been catastrophic. Together, arriving in a steady drumbeat over 4 months, they did exactly what they were designed to do. They kept Adrian Holloway's name in the news, kept the story alive long after most scandals would have faded, kept every new headline a fresh reminder to anyone considering doing business with him that his judgment had failed publicly, completely, and on the record. Desmond Cale, to his credit, fought hard and settled most of it efficiently. But the settlements cost money, and the money, increasingly, was running out faster than Adrian had ever imagined it could. The trust had taken 60% of his equity. The divorce settlement and asset division had taken another significant chunk. Legal fees ate into what remained at a rate that started to genuinely alarm him by the second month. "You need to sell the apartment in Aspen," Desmond told him during one of their increasingly grim weekly calls. "And the car collection. All of it. Not just the spares. I know it's hard to hear, Adrian, but liquidity is the only thing standing between you and a much worse situation." "It's just things," Adrian said, and was surprised to hear that he meant it. A year earlier, the idea of selling the Aspen property would have felt like losing a limb. Now it felt almost like relief. One less thing to maintain the illusion that any of it had mattered as much as he'd once believed. He sold the apartment. He sold the cars. He sold eventually the membership at the club where he'd once closed 9-figure deals over lunch, where men who used to return his calls within minutes now let them sit for days, where the maitre d' who used to greet him by name began addressing him with quiet, devastating precision as Sir Spult. Evelyn, meanwhile, was building something else entirely. It started small. A conversation with Patricia Osei about what had happened to her during the divorce proceedings. How many of the financial irregularities Adrian had buried were structurally easy to hide because of how little protection minority spouses and silent partners had in fast-growing tech companies. It started to take shape as an idea over long nights nursing Ethan, scrolling through articles about other founders, other partners, other families who'd been blindsided the way she had been, who'd discovered too late that the person they trusted most had built an entire architecture of concealment around them. "I want to start something," she told Claire one evening, the two of them sitting on the floor of the Tribeca penthouse, while Ethan, 4 months old now, lay on a blanket between them, gumming a soft fabric block with fierce concentration. "Like what?" "A foundation, something that protects people. Employees, spouses, early investors, whoever gets steamrolled when a founder decides the rules don't apply to him." Evelyn watched her son grab for the block and miss, try again, succeed, the small triumph of it lighting up his whole face. "I have the resources now. I have the story, unfortunately, and I have absolutely no interest in spending the rest of my life being known only as the woman Adrian Holloway humiliated." Claire smiled, the first easy smile Evelyn had seen on her sister's face in months. "What would you call it?" Evelyn thought about it for a long moment, watching Ethan, thinking about the hospital room, the 11 missed calls, the version of herself who had sat alone on the edge of a bed and called her husband 5 times into silence. "The Mercer Accountability Project," she said finally, "something that makes sure nobody else has to find out the truth the way I did." It wasn't a fully formed plan yet, just an idea, rough-edged and ambitious, sketched out on a legal pad between feedings and sleepless nights. But it was the first thing in months that had made Evelyn feel something other than grief or rage, the first thing that felt like it belonged to a future she was building on purpose, instead of one that had simply happened to her. By winter, Adrian's fall from public life was nearly complete. Holloway dynamics under Marcus's steady, unglamorous leadership had stabilized. Share price recovering slowly, investor confidence returning in increments, The company's identity gradually decoupling from the man whose name was still, technically, on the building's lobby plaque, though there was already talk among the new board of changing that too. Adrian watched it happen from a distance, scrolling through industry news in the service department that had started to feel less like a temporary inconvenience and more like the actual shape of his life now. He wasn't broke, not in any way the world would recognize as broke, but he was no longer the man who'd once stood on the deck of a yacht believing money could absorb any consequence indefinitely. He had learned in the space of a single brutal year that there were some things money had never actually been protecting him from. It had just been delaying the bill. He requested visitation with Ethan twice a week, and Evelyn, true to the boundaries she'd drawn in the hospital room months earlier, agreed. Supervised at first, at a neutral location, a quiet park near the Tribeca apartment where Adrian sat on a bench every Tuesday and Saturday afternoon, watching his son grow from a sleeping bundle into a baby who could sit up, who could reach for things, who eventually, on a cold afternoon in late February, looked directly at Adrian and laughed. An open, delighted, completely unguarded sound that broke something loose in Adrian's chest he hadn't expected. "He's getting big," Adrian said quietly to Evelyn, who stood a few feet away, arms crossed against the cold, watching the two of them with an expression she hadn't quite figured out how to soften yet. "He is. Thank you for letting me come." "I'm not doing it for you, Adrian." She said it without cruelty, just fact. "I'm doing it because he deserves the chance to know you, on the chance you turn out to actually be worth knowing." Adrian nodded, accepting it, because it was the only thing she'd offered him in months that felt like a door instead of a wall. And for the first time since the night on the yacht, Adrian Holloway understood that whatever came next in his life, he was going to have to actually earn it. Not negotiate for it, not buy his way into it, but earn it slowly, one Tuesday and one Saturday at a time, in a small cold park, watching a boy who hadn't yet learned to hold his failures against him. By the time Ethan turned 1, the cold park bench visits had become something closer to routine than punishment, and Evelyn found herself, somewhat to her own surprise, no longer dreading the sight of Adrian's car pulling up along the curb on Tuesday and Saturday afternoons. She still didn't trust him. Trust, she'd come to understand over the past year, wasn't something that came back all at once. It was something that had to be rebuilt. One kept promise at a time, the way a contractor rebuilds a house that's burned down, slowly, board by board, with no guarantee the structure would ever feel as solid as it had before the fire. But Adrian had, against every expectation she'd carried into that hospital room, kept showing up. He hadn't missed a single visitation in 11 months. He'd sat through a stomach flu that left Ethan cranky and inconsolable for 2 hours straight, hadn't flinched, hadn't made an excuse to leave early the way the old Adrian would have. He'd learned, clumsily at first and then with something like real competence, how to change a diaper, how to mash sweet potato to the exact consistency Ethan would tolerate, how to recognize the specific cry that meant tired versus the one that meant hungry versus the one that meant nothing was actually wrong, and he just wanted to be held. "You're better at this than I expected," Evelyn admitted one Saturday in early spring, watching Adrian crouch on the playground mulch, steadying Ethan's wobbling first attempts at standing. "Low bar," Adrian said, not looking up, his attention entirely on his son's unsteady fists gripping his fingers. "I missed his birth. I think better than expected was always going to be an easy bar to clear." It was the kind of joke that would have sounded bitter coming from him a year earlier, defensive, deflecting. Now it just sounded honest, and Evelyn found she didn't mind it. "How's the apartment?" she asked, mostly to make conversation, mostly because the silences between them had started to feel less loaded than they used to. "Small," Adrian shrugged. "Honestly, I don't mind it. I used to think I needed 11,000 square feet to feel like I'd accomplished something. Turns out I just needed somewhere quiet enough to think." He glanced up at her. "I started seeing someone. A therapist, I mean. Not," he caught himself, "not a person. A therapist." Evelyn raised an eyebrow, genuinely surprised. "You? In therapy?" "Twice a week since January." He looked almost embarrassed admitting it, which was itself new. The old Adrian had treated vulnerability like a competitive disadvantage, something to be managed and minimized rather than disclosed. "Desmond thought it would help with the custody hearing, optics-wise. Honestly, I thought it was going to be a box-checking exercise, too. He caught Ethan as the boy pitched forward, laughing, into his arms. Turns out I had a lot more to unpack than I expected. Most of it started long before Vanessa. Long before you, probably. Evelyn didn't ask him to elaborate, and he didn't offer to. But something about the admission settled differently in her chest than his apologies from a year earlier had. Those had felt like performances, words assembled for an audience. This felt like something closer to the truth, offered without an obvious angle, without anything attached to it that he was trying to get from her in return. The Mercer Accountability Project launched formally that June, in a modest converted brownstone in the West Village that Evelyn had purchased with a portion of the trust's discretionary funds, set up specifically to offer free legal consultation and financial literacy support to spouses, early employees, and minority partners who suspected they were being financially or professionally exploited by founders and executives with disproportionate power. The launch event was small and deliberately unglamorous. No champagne, no press release dripping with the kind of self-congratulation Evelyn had spent a decade watching Adrian's industry produce at every opportunity. Just folding chairs, modest catering, and a room full of people who understood, in ways most of the city's wealth didn't, what it felt like to discover the architecture of your own life had been built around a lie. "I'm not here to talk about Adrian Holloway," Evelyn told the room, standing at a small podium with Ethan, now 18 months old, asleep against Claire's shoulder in the front row. "I'm sure most of you know the story already. The internet made sure of that." A few sympathetic, knowing laughs rippled through the room. But this isn't about revenge. I want to be very clear about that, because I think it's the easiest thing to misunderstand about what we're building here. I'm not interested in punishing one man for the rest of my life. I'm interested in making sure the structures that let him hide what he was doing, the shell companies, the undisclosed accounts, the legal blind spots that protect powerful people and leave everyone around them exposed, I'm interested in making those structures harder to hide behind. For anyone. Not just for me. The room applauded, and Evelyn felt something settle in her chest that she hadn't expected to feel that day. Not triumph, exactly. Something quieter and more durable than that. Purpose. The particular hard-won satisfaction of building something useful out of the wreckage of something that had nearly destroyed her. Patricia O.C. found her afterward, near the small reception table, glass of sparkling water in hand. "You did good work today." "I had good material." Evelyn glanced toward the front row, where Claire was gently bouncing Ethan, who'd woken and was now studying the room with the wide, unfiltered curiosity of a toddler encountering a new space. "I keep thinking about all the women who don't have a sister who can take 2 months off work, who don't have a family with the resources to hire someone like you. That's who this is actually for." "You know," Patricia said, watching her carefully, "a lot of people in your position would have just taken the settlement and disappeared somewhere quiet. Aspen, the Hamptons, wherever, lived comfortably and let the whole thing fade." "I thought about it," Evelyn smiled a little wryly. "For about a week, right after Ethan was born, I genuinely considered it, just disappearing. Raising him somewhere, nobody knew the story." She shook her head. "But I kept thinking about what I'd be teaching him if that's what I chose. That when something terrible happens to you, the right response is to hide from it. I didn't want that to be his inheritance. I wanted his inheritance to be, I don't know, proof that you can survive the worst thing that's ever happened to you and still choose to build something good." The custody arrangement evolved gradually over the following year, the supervised park visits expanding first into unsupervised afternoons, then into full weekends once Ethan turned 2, then eventually into the kind of flexible, functional co-parenting arrangement that neither of them would have believed possible standing in that hospital room 2 years earlier. It wasn't smooth. There were fights over school choices when Ethan turned 3 and they disagreed about a private preschool's philosophy, over a birthday party Adrian had wanted to throw at a venue Evelyn found needlessly extravagant, over the lingering, complicated question of what Ethan would eventually be told about the photo, about the yacht, about the story that anyone with an internet connection could still find with a simple search of his father's name. "He's going to find out eventually," Adrian said one evening, the two of them sitting at the small kitchen table in Evelyn's apartment, a rare moment of quiet after Ethan, 3.5 now, had finally gone down for the night. They developed an uneasy but workable habit of these evening check-ins, neither quite friendship nor anything resembling what they'd once been, but something functional, and increasingly, something almost comfortable. Kids at school will say things eventually, or he'll search my name himself someday, and the first 10 results are going to be about the worst night of both our lives. I know. Evelyn turned her coffee mug slowly between her palms. I've thought about it a lot, actually. I don't think we lie to him and him. I don't think we pretend it didn't happen, but I also don't think a 5-year-old needs the full forensic accounting of his father's affair. She looked up at Adrian. I think when he's old enough to ask real questions, we tell him the truth, that his father made a terrible mistake, that it hurt people badly, and that he spent years trying to become someone better because of it. I think that's actually a more useful story than pretending it never happened. Adrian was quiet for a long moment. You'd let me be part of telling him that? Honestly? I think he deserves to hear it from both of us, together. Evelyn met his eyes. Not because I've forgotten what you did, Adrian. I haven't. I don't think I ever fully will. But because punishing you forever isn't actually protecting him. It's just making sure he grows up in the middle of a war that isn't his. She paused. And because you've earned a small amount of that trust back, slowly, not all of it. Maybe not most of it. But some. Something in Adrian's face shifted, a kind of quiet, undramatic gratitude that didn't ask for more than what was being offered. That's more than I deserve. Probably, Evelyn agreed, not unkindly. But Ethan doesn't need a father who only gets what he deserves. He needs a father who shows up. You've been doing that. I'd be lying to both of us if I pretended I hadn't noticed. Holloway Dynamics, under Marcus's leadership, went public with a secondary offering that spring, the company's value having not just recovered but in some ways exceeded its pre-scandal numbers, buoyed by a reputation for stability and governance that Marcus had deliberately cultivated in the 2 years since taking over, a pointed, if unspoken contrast to the version of the company Adrian had run. Adrian read about it in a financial newsletter one morning, sitting alone in his apartment with coffee going cold beside him, and felt something he hadn't expected to feel: pride, uncomplicated and genuine, for a company he no longer controlled and people who no longer fully trusted him. He'd taken a position by then at a small fintech startup run by a former junior engineer he'd mentored years earlier, not as CEO, not even close to it, but as a strategic advisor, 3 days a week, helping a team of 20 build something modest and useful instead of something designed primarily to make him richer. The smaller scale of it had been humbling at first, a daily reminder of how far he'd fallen from the boardrooms and the yacht decks and the rooms where people used to stand up a little straighter when he walked in. But there was something underneath the humbling that surprised him, some quieter satisfaction in work that didn't come wrapped in performance, in spectacle, in the constant need to be seen as the smartest, most powerful person in every room he entered. You seem different, his therapist, a measured, patient woman named Dr. Lillian Okonjo, observed during one of their Thursday sessions. Even your posture's different than it was a year ago. I think I finally understand what Evelyn meant, Adrian said slowly, working through the thought as he spoke it. When she told me in the hospital that I'd never once chosen her when it was inconvenient, I used to think that was an exaggeration, something said in anger. He shook his head. It wasn't. I spent 18 years building a life around never having to do anything inconvenient, never sitting with discomfort, never showing up somewhere I didn't immediately benefit from showing up. And I told myself that was ambition, that was drive. He looked down at his hands. It was just selfishness with better branding. And now? Now I show up to a park bench twice a week, sometimes in the rain, to watch my son eat sand he's not supposed to eat, and try to climb things he's not tall enough to climb yet. A faint, genuine smile crossed his face. It's the least convenient thing I've ever chosen to do consistently in my entire life. And it's the only thing I've ever done that's made me feel like I actually deserve to call myself somebody's father. The Mercer Accountability Project grew faster than Evelyn had anticipated, expanding within 18 months from the single brownstone office to a small staff of 12, a partnership with 2 major law schools offering pro bono clinics, and a growing reputation in business and legal circles as one of the few organizations actively working to close the structural gaps, that let founders like Adrian, like the old Adrian, she reminded herself, the version of him that increasingly felt like a different person from the man who now sat across from her at the kitchen table some evenings, hide financial misconduct behind layers of corporate complexity. She was profiled in a major business magazine that autumn, a long feature that traced her path from the hospital room to the brownstone, careful and respectful, in a way that surprised her, given how brutally the same outlets had once covered the scandal itself. The journalist, a thoughtful woman named Imogen Castellano, asked her near the end of the interview the question Evelyn had been bracing for the entire conversation. "Do you hate him? Adrian, I mean. After everything." Evelyn considered the question seriously, the way she considered most things now, without the reflexive bitterness that would have colored her answer 2 years earlier. "I don't think hate is sustainable," she said finally. "I tried it for a while. It's exhausting, carrying that much anger every single day. What I feel now is more complicated than hate. I think he failed catastrophically, in a way that nearly destroyed both of us, and I think he spent the years since actually trying to become someone different. Those two things can both be true. I don't owe him my trust back completely. I don't think I ever will, not fully, but I owe my son a father who's trying, if that father is genuinely trying, and Adrian is." She paused. "I built this foundation because of what he did to me, but I'd be lying if I said I built it only out of anger. I built it because I learned, the hard way, that the people who get hurt by men like Adrian deserve better tools than I had. That's not really about him anymore. That's about everyone who comes after." The article ran with a photo of Evelyn standing in the brownstone's main office. Ethan, nearly 4 now, dark-haired, sharp-eyed, with a stubborn set to his jaw that Claire liked to joke he'd inherited from his mother and nobody else. Perched on her hip, both of them looking directly at the camera, unguarded and entirely unbothered by whatever story anyone wanted to tell about them. It was, Evelyn thought when she finally saw the printed version, exactly the image she wanted people to remember. Not the woman alone in a hospital bed, not the scandal, the yacht, the photo that had once defined her entire public identity overnight. Just a mother and a son, standing in something they'd built together, looking forward instead of back. 8 years moved through the city the way years do when nobody's watching the calendar too closely. Not in dramatic leaps, but in small, accumulating changes that only became visible when you stepped back far enough to see the whole shape of them. Ethan Mercer turned 11 that October, tall for his age, with his mother's stubborn jaw and, increasingly, something of his father's restless curiosity. The kind of kid who took apart the kitchen toaster at age 8, just to understand the heating coil and then, to Evelyn's mild horror and considerable pride, put it back together correctly. The Mercer Accountability Project had grown into something that occasionally got cited in actual legislative hearings, a fact that still struck Evelyn as faintly surreal whenever she sat in a conference room on Capitol Hill, no longer the woman who'd once sat alone in a hospital bed refreshing a phone that wouldn't ring, but an actual voice in conversations about corporate transparency law. She'd testified twice before subcommittees on financial disclosure reform. She'd hired 40 people. She'd watched, with quiet satisfaction, as 2 other foundations modeled directly on hers opened in Chicago and Austin, run by women who'd found their way to her organization after discovering, the way she once had, that the life they thought they were living had been built on a foundation someone else had quietly hollowed out. She hadn't remarried. There had been one relationship, a kind, steady architect named Theo Briggs, that lasted nearly 2 years before ending amicably, neither of them quite willing to say out loud that something in Evelyn had simply never fully reopened after Adrian, not out of lingering love for him, but out of a hard-won wariness that had become, for better or worse, part of who she now was. She didn't regret it. She had built, in the years since that hospital room, a life that didn't require a partner to feel complete, a life with Ethan at the center of it, with Claire and Diane a constant, steadying presence, with work that mattered and a sense of purpose she'd never fully possessed in the years she'd spent as Adrian Holloway's wife, performing a happiness that had quietly curdled long before she ever found the receipt from the hotel on Spring Street. Adrian, for his part, had built something smaller and steadier than the empire he'd lost. The fintech startup where he'd started as a part-time advisor had grown, slowly and without spectacle, into a respected mid-sized company, and Adrian, never CEO again, by his own choice as much as anyone else's, had settled into a role as something closer to mentor than executive, the gray now fully claimed in his hair, his face carrying the kind of lines that came from years rather than stress alone. He still lived modestly. He'd never moved back into anything resembling the world of yachts and Green Street lofts, had in fact sold most of what remained of that old life within the first 3 years, donating a significant portion of the proceeds, quietly, without press, in a gesture he'd insisted Evelyn's foundation not publicize, even though Patricia Osei had argued it would be good optics, to the Mercer Accountability Project itself, a fact that even Evelyn, when she learned of it, hadn't entirely known how to respond to. "You didn't have to do that," she'd told him, the two of them standing in the kitchen of her apartment one evening, Ethan upstairs finishing homework, the easy, unremarkable rhythm of their co-parenting routine by then so worn in it barely registered as remarkable anymore. "I know I didn't have to." Adrian had shrugged, uncomfortable in the particular way he still got whenever anyone tried to thank him for something. "It felt right. You built something good out of what I broke. It seemed fair that some of what I have left should go toward that, instead of just sitting in an account reminding me of who I used to be." It was, Evelyn thought at the time, one of the more honest things he'd ever said to her. Not an apology, not a performance, just a quiet, practical acknowledgement of the math of consequence, the way actions kept costing you long after the headlines moved on to someone else's scandal. The custody arrangement had evolved by Ethan's 11th year into something so unremarkable that neither Evelyn nor Adrian thought of it as an arrangement anymore. Ethan split his time between them with the easy fluidity of a kid who'd never known anything different, who had 2 bedrooms and 2 different apartments, and considered both of them simply home, who had grown up with a clarity about his parents' history that neither Evelyn nor Adrian had managed to fully predict back when they debated over that kitchen table years earlier how much of the truth he deserved to know and when. They'd told him the broad outline when he was 7, sitting together, deliberately together, a united front Evelyn had insisted on, in the living room of her apartment. They hadn't used Vanessa Hale's name, they hadn't described the yacht in detail, or the photo, or the specific 11 missed calls that Evelyn still, on bad nights, could recite from memory like a wound that had healed crooked. "Your dad made a really big mistake when you were born," Evelyn had said carefully, watching Ethan's face for signs that the conversation was going somewhere he wasn't ready for. "He wasn't there when you came into the world because he was somewhere else, doing something that mattered to him a lot less than he understood at the time. It hurt me. It hurt our family, and for a long time I wasn't sure your dad and I would ever be able to be in the same room without it being really hard. But you are now," Ethan had said, 7 years old and matter-of-fact in the particular way young children sometimes manage to cut straight through complexity adults spent years tangled in. "We are now," Adrian had confirmed, his voice rougher than usual, "because I spent a long time trying to become someone who deserved to be in the same room as both of you. I'm still working on it, honestly. I think I probably always will be." Ethan had considered this with the brief, serious attention kids gave to things they sensed mattered without fully grasping why. "Did you say sorry to Mom?" "Many times," Adrian had said. "Did she forgive you?" Evelyn and Adrian had exchanged a look across the room, the kind of look that carried 8 years of complicated history compressed into half a second. "Forgiveness is complicated, baby," Evelyn had said gently. "I don't hate your dad anymore. I trust him with you, completely. You've probably noticed that since you spend half your time at his place. But what happened still happened. I don't think you ever fully forget something like that. You just learn to carry it differently." It was, looking back, exactly the right amount of truth for a 7-year-old, and as Ethan grew, 8, 9, 10, now 11, the conversation had deepened in pieces, never all at once, never more than he seemed ready to hold. By the time he was old enough to type his father's name into a search engine himself, which he eventually did, alone, at age 10, on a school laptop during a free period, the broad shape of the story held no power to shock him the way it might have if it had landed without warning. He came home that day quieter than usual and found Adrian, it happened to be a Thursday, one of his father's nights, sitting at the small kitchen table in the modest 2-bedroom apartment Adrian had eventually bought. A real home now, instead of a serviced placeholder, with Ethan's room decorated in the dinosaur theme he'd been obsessed with 2 years earlier and hadn't yet asked his father to update. I read the articles, Ethan said, dropping his backpack by the door, watching his father's face carefully. The old ones. About the yacht. Adrian set down the dish towel he'd been holding, and for a moment something old and frightened crossed his face. The particular fear of a man who had spent years building something fragile and new, terrified it might shatter the instant the past caught up to it. Okay, Adrian said carefully. Do you want to talk about it? There was a lady, Vanessa. Ethan said the name without inflection, testing it, the way kids test words they're not sure they're allowed to say. And you missed it, me being born, because you were with her instead. Yes, Adrian said. He didn't soften it, didn't reach for an excuse, the way he might have done years earlier without even fully noticing he was doing it. That's exactly what happened. Why? It was, Adrian would think later, the hardest question anyone had ever asked him, harder than anything the board had asked during his removal, harder than anything Patricia Osei had asked across a mediation table, because his 11-year-old son deserved an actual answer, not a deflection, not a story engineered to make Adrian look less monstrous than he'd been. I thought I was the most important person in every room I walked into, Adrian said slowly. I'd spent so many years being told I was brilliant, that my time was valuable, that the company I built mattered more than almost anything else. That somewhere along the way, I started believing it. I believed it so completely that when your mom needed me, really needed me, the most she'd ever needed anyone in her whole life, some selfish part of me decided that whatever I was doing instead was more important. He met Ethan's eyes, didn't look away, even though every instinct told him to. There's no good reason, bud. I want you to hear that clearly, because I think some part of you might be looking for one, and I don't want you spending your life trying to find an explanation that makes it make sense. It doesn't make sense. I was wrong, completely, inexcusably wrong. Ethan was quiet for a long moment, processing this with the same serious focus he brought to the toaster he'd taken apart 3 years earlier. Mom said you've been trying to be better for a long time. I have been. Every day, honestly, for the last 10 years. I don't know if I'll ever fully make up for what I did. I'm not sure that's actually possible, but I know I'd rather spend the rest of my life trying than spend it pretending it didn't happen. Do you still see her, Vanessa? No. Haven't spoken to her in almost 10 years. Adrian paused. That part of my life, the yacht, the parties, all of it, that wasn't actually who I wanted to be. It was just easier than figuring out who I actually wanted to be. It took losing almost everything to make me slow down enough to ask the question seriously. Ethan nodded slowly, and something in his shoulders relaxed, the particular tension of a child who'd been bracing for a worse answer than the one he'd received. Okay, he said finally. I'm glad you're trying. It wasn't absolution. 11-year-olds didn't grant absolution. Not really, not the kind that mattered. But it was something close to acceptance, and Adrian, sitting in his small kitchen with his son across the table from him, understood that it was more grace than he'd ever expected to receive, and considerably more than he believed, in his most honest moments, that he actually deserved. Evelyn heard about the conversation that weekend when Ethan came home and relayed it to her in the unguarded, slightly clinical way kids sometimes report emotionally significant events, like he was summarizing a school assignment rather than processing something that had clearly mattered enormously. He told me the truth, Ethan said, sitting at the kitchen counter while Evelyn chopped vegetables for dinner. He didn't make excuses. That's good, Evelyn said carefully, setting down the knife. How do you feel about it? Ethan considered the question with the same serious focus that had become, over the years, one of the qualities Evelyn loved most fiercely about her son. The way he refused to rush past hard things, the way he sat with discomfort instead of deflecting it, a quality she sometimes thought, with a complicated mixture of pride and grief, he might have developed specifically because he'd grown up watching his mother model it for him after the worst night of her life. Sad, mostly, he said finally. Sad that it happened, but also, I don't know, glad he didn't lie about it. I think it would have been worse if he'd tried to make it sound like it wasn't that bad. Evelyn crossed the kitchen and pulled her son into a hug, holding him a beat longer than he probably wanted to be held at 11 years old, and felt something settle in her chest that had been unsettled, in one form or another, since the night she'd sat alone on the edge of a bed, calling a husband who wouldn't answer. She thought often about what she would say if anyone ever asked her so, really asked her, not for a magazine profile, not for a polished soundbite, what she'd learned from the worst night of her life. The truthful answer, she'd come to understand over the years, wasn't really about Adrian at all. Not anymore. It was something closer to this, that the people who hurt you most badly are rarely cartoonish villains, rarely entirely without the capacity to become something better, and that the hardest, most necessary work of healing wasn't deciding whether to hate them forever or forgive them completely, but learning to hold both truths at once, that what happened mattered, that it had cost her dearly, that it had also, somehow, become the foundation of the most meaningful work of her life. Not because the pain had been worth it. Pain like that was never worth it, but because she had refused to let it be the only thing that defined her. The foundation held its 10th anniversary gala that spring, a modest affair compared to the kind of glittering events Adrian's old world used to throw, held in the same West Village brownstone where the project had started, expanded now into the building next door, the two connected by a small interior courtyard that had become Evelyn's favorite part of the entire operation. Adrian came, at Evelyn's invitation, standing quietly near the back of the room during the speeches, not as a guest of honor, not as anyone the room was particularly interested in, just as Ethan's father watching his son, 14 now, taller than Evelyn already, gangly in the particular way teenage boys sometimes were before their bodies finished deciding what shape they intended to become, stand up at the podium and read a short speech he'd written himself for the occasion, his voice cracking once with adolescent unpredictability, steadying again as he found his rhythm. "My mom built this place because of something that happened to our family a long time ago," Ethan said, looking out at a room full of people whose lives had been shaped by exactly the kind of betrayal his mother had survived. "I used to think the story was just about what my dad did wrong. And it is, partly. But I think the bigger story is what my mom did after. She could have just been angry forever. Honestly, she had every right to be. Instead, she built something that's helped, 40,000 people now, more than that?" He glanced toward Evelyn, who nodded, eyes bright. 41,000 people who didn't have to go through what she went through completely alone, because she made sure there was somewhere for them to go. He paused, looking briefly toward the back of the room, toward his father, who met his gaze steadily. "I think the lesson isn't really that bad. Things don't happen to good people. They do. My mom is proof of that. I think the lesson is that what you choose to do after the bad thing happens is the only part you actually get to control. And she chose this. She chose to turn the worst night of her life into something that's made thousands of other nights better for people she's never even met." The room applauded, and Evelyn, standing near the front, found herself wiping her eyes without any embarrassment at all. The particular unguarded emotion of a mother watching her son articulate, more clearly than she'd ever managed herself, the actual meaning of everything she'd built. Afterward, in the quiet of the courtyard, Adrian found her standing alone near a small fountain, the party noise muffled behind glass doors, the spring evening cool and clear above them. "He's remarkable," Adrian said. "I know I don't get to take much credit for that, but he is." "You get some credit," Evelyn said, surprising herself slightly with the ease of saying it. "Not all of it. Not even most of it, honestly. But some." She turned to look at him properly, this man she'd once loved completely, then hated completely, then spent a decade learning to regard with something more complicated and more durable than either of those simpler feelings. "You showed up, Adrian, for 10 years. Every visitation, every recital, every terrible middle school basketball game where he sat on the bench the entire time and you stayed for all 4 quarters anyway." She allowed herself a small, genuine smile. "That matters. I want you to know that I see it. I've seen it for years. It's the only thing I've ever done that I'm actually proud of," Adrian said quietly. "Not the company, not any of it. Just this. Just choosing him, over and over, even on the days it would have been easier not to." They stood together for a moment in the cool evening air, two people who had once destroyed something together and had spent the decade since carefully, imperfectly, rebuilding something else entirely. Not a marriage, not even quite a friendship, but something honest, something neither of them had to perform for the other anymore. I used to think, Adrian said eventually, that the worst thing that ever happened to me was losing the company. The board, the lawsuits, all of it. I used to lie awake some nights in that horrible serviced apartment, furious about everything I'd lost. He shook his head slowly. It took me a long time to understand that the company was never the thing I actually lost that mattered. The company was just money, structures, a building with my name on the lobby plaque, until they finally changed it. What I actually lost, what I came so close to losing forever, was the chance to know my own son. And I almost threw that away for a few hours on a boat I don't even remember being worth it. You didn't lose it, Evelyn said. You came close, but you didn't. You chose to come back every single time you were given the chance, and eventually that became the only part of the story that mattered to him. She looked back toward the glass doors where she could see Ethan through the window, laughing with one of the foundation's young staff members, easy and unguarded in a way that still sometimes struck her as a small miracle, given everything. That's the part I hope he remembers most when he's grown and he looks back on all of this. Not the yacht, not the headlines. Just that his father made a catastrophic mistake, and instead of running from it, he spent a decade proving day after day that the mistake wasn't the whole story. Years later, and this was the part of the story Evelyn would sometimes tell, in careful, edited form, when she spoke at conferences or sat for interviews about the Foundation's work, the part that always seemed to land hardest with audiences who'd expected a simpler, more satisfying narrative of villain punished and victim triumphant. Ethan would graduate from college and choose, somewhat to everyone's surprise, not finance, not technology, but law, with a specific interest in corporate accountability and fiduciary responsibility, a path so clearly shaped by the formative wound of his own family's story that nobody who knew him found it particularly surprising at all. Adrian, by then in his late 50s, had grayed fully, had grown into a quieter, smaller life than the one he'd once built so aggressively, and seemed, by every account from the people who knew him, genuinely at peace with the smallness of it. A modest apartment, a steady role at the fintech company that had given him purpose without spectacle, regular dinners with his son that had evolved over the years into something resembling actual friendship rather than the careful, supervised reconciliation they'd started with. He never remarried either. He told Dr. Okonjo, in one of their sessions during his 60th year, that he'd come to believe he didn't actually deserve the kind of uncomplicated domestic happiness he'd once assumed was simply owed to him by virtue of his success, not as punishment, not as some lingering act of self-flagellation, but as an honest accounting of what he'd traded away and what he'd chosen, instead to spend the remainder of his life trying to earn back in smaller, quieter increments. Being a present father, being an honest colleague, being, finally, someone whose word actually meant something to the people in his life, instead of a man whose charm had always been a more reliable currency than his follow-through. "Do you regret it?" Ethan asked him once. The two of them sitting on a porch at a small lake house Adrian had bought modestly in his 50s, the kind of unglamorous, sturdy place that would have horrified the man he'd once been. "The yacht, all of it, if you could go back." "Every single day," Adrian said, without hesitation. "Not because of what it cost me. I want to be honest with you about that, because I think it matters. For a long time, my regret was mostly about the company, the money, the way the world stopped looking at me like I mattered." He looked out at the water, quiet for a moment. "It took years before my regret became actually about you, about what I took from you, the chance to have a father who was there from the very beginning, instead of one who had to spend a decade trying to prove he deserved to stick around." He turned back to his son. "I can't undo that night, Ethan. I've made peace with that. But I've spent every day since trying to make sure it was the worst thing I ever did to you, instead of just the first in a long line of disappointments. I hope I've managed that. I genuinely don't know if I get to decide that for myself." "You have," Ethan said simply. "You did." Evelyn, for her part, never fully let go of what had happened. Not in the way some people imagined forgiveness was supposed to work. A clean erasure, a wiping of the slate. She carried it the way most people carry their deepest wounds, integrated into who she'd become rather than overcome by it, present but no longer governing, a scar rather than an open injury. The Foundation continued its work long after Ethan graduated, long after he eventually joined its board himself, bringing his legal training to bear on the same structural questions that had once blindsided his mother on a February afternoon when she found a hotel receipt she wasn't supposed to find. She thought sometimes, on quiet evenings, about the woman she'd been on that night 11 years earlier, sitting alone on the edge of a bed, calling a husband who wouldn't answer, certain that her entire life was collapsing around her in real time. She wished, in a way, she could reach back across the years and tell that woman something true, that the worst night of her life would not in fact be the thing that defined her, that she would survive it, and more than survive it, that she would take the wreckage of that betrayal and build something so much larger and more lasting than the marriage she'd lost, something that would outlive any headline, any scandal, any photograph posted carelessly at 12:14 in the morning by a man who, for one brief catastrophic night, had believed that nothing he did would ever truly cost him anything. He had been wrong about that, completely and permanently. Everything costs something, eventually. The only real choice anyone gets, Evelyn had come to believe, watching her son grow into a man who carried both his parents' worst night and their decade of hard, deliberate rebuilding inside the same understanding, is what you choose to build out of what the cost leaves behind. The story didn't end with revenge, because revenge had never actually been what Evelyn wanted. Not really. Not even in the rawest, angriest months right after the betrayal. It ended instead the way most honest stories about real human failure and real human repair tend to end. Not with a villain destroyed and a hero crowned, but with two deeply flawed people who had once nearly ruined each other, finding their way, slowly and imperfectly, towards something that looked less like victory and more like peace. A boy who grew up knowing both the worst thing his father ever did and the decade of quiet, unglamorous work it took to become someone different. A mother who turned her own worst night into a lifeline for thousands of strangers who would never know her name beyond a headline. And a father who learned far too late to undo the damage, but not too late to matter, that the only fortune actually worth protecting had never been the one sitting in his accounts. It had been sitting, the entire time, in a hospital room he'd nearly missed, in the small, furious cry of a son who would spend the rest of his life deciding every single day whether his father's worst mistake would be allowed to be his last word. It wasn't. In the end, it never had to be.